Over time, the democratic system becomes rather robotic and divorced from the nation. And the nation is under attack because we, the citizenry, are not exclusively the voters. We are on the cusp of a meta-political movement in which the society, the nation, strikes back against the machine of democracy itself. Welcome back to Men and the City. It's a beautiful day here in Buenos Aires, so I thought we could have another chat about politics. And in light of what's happened over the last few weeks, not just in financial markets or in the United Kingdom, it seems we are perpetually on the brink of something big happening, be that a war or government collapse or something of that nature. Now's a good time, I think, to talk about what seems to be the biggest threat to the Western world, which is democracy. So today's video is going to be called Democracy Against the Nation. Now, as most of you know, because you're living in the United States or the UK or probably in Western Europe, democracy has become the godhead of the modern world. Indeed, it is the flagship of progress. Whenever there is the maiden speech of a new parliamentarian, for instance, or the State of the Union from the US president, or some blathering nonsense that comes out of the European Commission, it's always couched in praiseful language about democracy. And indeed, democracy, according to the bureaucrats that run the Western world, the gerontocracy, as I call them, they claim again and again that it is democracy that defines our values and defines what the West is today. Our governments, our society, our ethos, etc., etc.
The strength of democracy is that it empowers the people.
And that raises some interesting questions, especially in light of what's happened to democratic societies over the last 50 years. It's noteworthy, is it not, that election after election, decade after decade, year after year, that elections come and go, people vote, and yet the same policies seem to persist. Policies like open borders, for instance. Well, what's really going on here? What is happening? And why is democracy, which supposedly is inextricably tied to our national identities, becoming a threat? Or rather, how has it been weaponized against us? There's a very famous German sociologist named Ferdinand Tönnies, and Tönnies talked about two distinct societies. One is called Gemeinschaft, which is basically a nation that consists of people that share a common identity, a common history, a common language, a common religion, a common sense of togetherness and esprit de corps. The other, Gesellschaft, is a society of economic relationships or a society of transactions that are almost robotic or bureaucratic. Now, I draw attention to these two distinctions because in one, the Gesellschaft society, people are essentially democratic. They come together to vote for various policies. They share a common democratic zeal, I guess, in the sense that they participate politically, and then they sort of go about their lives economically or otherwise. But ultimately, it's this sort of political activism, or participation rather, the democratic voting system, that is what unifies them together. Little else beyond economic transactions. I go to a store, I buy things, the store owner sells them to me, etc., etc. But Gemeinschaft suggests that there's something far deeper, that there is in fact underneath this democratic system a nation, and moreover that the nation actually creates the irrigating systems responsible for cultivating that democratic system to begin with. Over time, the democratic system becomes rather robotic and divorced from the nation. Now, how does this happen? Why does it happen? Well, it happens, at least it's happened in our case, because there is a distinction between the citizenry and the voter. And this distinction is crucial to understand. It is the genesis of the conflict that's happening in Great Britain as we speak, and in the broader Western world around immigration. Because immigration is the idea essentially that there is no real nation. Again, this is why the elites say what they do. This is why the gerontocracy repeatedly advocates the idea that somehow we are just a country of Democrats who come together periodically to vote in a participatory fashion. But there's something more going on now, isn't there? There is this thing called the nation. And the nation is under attack because we, the citizenry, are not exclusively the voters. Voters are not necessarily citizens. They could be anybody. They could be refugees. They could be immigrants. They could be special interests. Voters, in this sense, represent an inexhaustible quantity of humanity. They're interchangeable. They're malleable. But the citizenry is not. The citizenry comes from the nation. Indeed, they are the progenitors of that democratic system. But over time, especially because of immigration and the distinction between voter and citizenry, the democratic system abandons the citizenry. The democratic system begins to accommodate, it begins to reorganize around the future voting population. And it does this for very obvious reasons, because of demographics, because ultimately voters, as I said, can be anybody. So when democratic leaders are elected, they are looking for constituents. They're looking for the future foundations of their political parties and movements. And so rather than represent the legacy population, in this case the citizenry, which is a fixed amount that's shrinking as we speak because death rates are exceeding birth rates, they shift their focus and prioritize the interests of the immigrant population, who are the future voters of the country. Now, this process, this unwinding, spreads. It starts in the government, but eventually it spreads to the private sector because corporations, Fortune 500 companies, small businesses, services of every kind, they are responsive to the state. And so because the state dissolves the distinction between citizen and voter, they do too. And furthermore, because voters often are immigrants or refugees or something of that nature, democracy very quickly moves to protect those groups because they're special minorities. And as such, they actually have more rights in many ways than the citizenry does itself. So the whole society, root and branch, within a generation or 2 generations of this mass immigration process, in which there is a dissolution of the distinction between voter and citizen, turns against the citizenry. Now, it is my view that we have more or less reached that point in the Western world, and so you're beginning to see blowback. The question becomes, where do we go from here? Obviously, the democratic system is fundamentally broken. It's spiraling out of control. It has been contaminated and perverted against the citizenry, indeed weaponized against the citizenry. Well, that is when Gemeinschaft shifts back into the action. That is when the national consciousness of the citizenry spontaneously congeals once again.
Democracy, that is bad for American democracy.
Okay, we are a republic.
We're a republic.
We are
we're
not a
representative
democracy.
republic. We're not a democracy.
One thing we've been hearing at Trump rallies like this over the past few months is that America isn't really a democracy.
America's not a democracy, it's a republic.
It's not a democracy. Okay, democracy is actually not as good as you think it is.
Now, the political expression of this is nationalism. Nationalism, for all kinds of reasons that most of you are well aware of, is the boogeyman of democracy. Because nationalism speaks to something beyond voting, something beyond the robotic machine-like process of democratic politics, and on that basis is actually stronger than the democratic process itself. In other words, nationalism is a far more powerful political force than democracy. And ironically, over time, as many scholars from Plato to Thucydides and in fact the founding fathers themselves pointed out, democracy over time, unchecked, becomes a self-destructive system. And indeed it is, in my view, on the precipice of that self-destruction as we speak. But nationalism from Gemeinschaft then shifts into action. And when that happens, it does so very mysteriously. It does so very spontaneously. It does so in ways that are very hard to predict because nations are different. So the way that nationalism manifests in France or Great Britain or the United States, for instance, are going to look very different from one another because the national traditions of those societies are fundamentally different. We are, in other words, headed for a kind of rebalancing, a reversion back to Gemeinschaft. Now that presents a very precarious pathway, to be sure, but it is in that national consciousness, that Gemeinschaft, where the solutions to this imbalance and this ambiguity between the citizenry and the voter is going to be resolved. In other words, I think we're on the cusp of a meta-political movement in which the society, the nation, strikes back against the machine of democracy itself, which, as we know, has been subverted and weaponized against us by a narrow set of elites who want nothing less than the demographic destruction, full stop, of our societies. But, as I said, this is a cycle, and the democratic process is self-destructive and ultimately empowers the nation to resolve the problems that it causes. We are entering into that transitional period. So this is not the end of the West. It is the resurgence, the rebirth of Gemeinschaft, of nations, and that will be expressed in the nationalist movements to come. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.